Imagine you found a book. It looked fascinating, old, enchanting, but it didn't say who wrote it. How would you figure out who the author was? Without a clear title page, authorship can be nearly impossible to determine. Even works that have a title page, like Shakespeare, have had their authorship challenged. No book in human history has had its authorship contested, and no book has had as much at stake as the Bible. All major religions hinge, to one degree or another, on the divinity of the Bible, that it was dictated by God and written by Moses, and for centuries people generally accepted that. But at the end of the 17th century, that began to change. Scholars, most notably Benedict Spinoza, highlighted discrepancies in the text that seemed to indicate the Bible was not written by one person, but rather multiple authors. Why are there multiple names for God? Did Noah bring 2 animals into the ark, or 7? Did the brothers plan to sell Joseph, or plan to kill him? And what about those camels? They weren't domesticated until after the Bible was purportedly written. Beginning in the 19th century, more and more scholars began to question the traditional approach to the authorship of the Bible. In 1878, Julius Wellhausen proposed a theory for identifying different strands of the Bible, associating each of the major names of God with a different author. This form of criticism, known as documentary hypothesis, is a part of biblical criticism known as higher criticism. Higher criticism is focused on the composition and authorship of the Bible. Lower criticism, on the other hand, is primarily concerned with textual variations. Both provide important tools for examining the nature, context, and authenticity of the Bible. Think of higher criticism as trying to identify the multiple contributors of a single Wikipedia page, while lower criticism is more interested in making sure the quotes and text on that page are accurate. Underneath the question of the authorship of the Bible lies a question about authorship in general. What does it mean to be an author? If we look at our own lives as a text, is it coherent? Should it be? Maybe life is made up of multiple strands, orientations, stages that have been stitched together. Does that preclude the notion of having an underlying narrative that animates the text of our lives? In 1967, French critic Roland Barthes wrote the essay The Death of the Author. Barthes was concerned with how authorship can limit the breadth and modes of interpretation of a literary work. Instead, he argued, once a work of literature is published, the readers, through their own interpretations, become the authors. In some ways, this literary approach informs much of the battle over the authorship of the Bible and, more generally, how we relate to the narrative of our own lives. Namely, do the disparate stories, setbacks, and perspectives within any given text or person cohere into a unified whole? Or should that be determined by the readers, so to speak? James Coogle, a Harvard professor and the author of a series of books on biblical criticism, argues that it is nearly impossible to approach the Bible as a cohesive text. Instead, like most modern Bible critics, he argues that the text should be seen as a composition of several authors, and approaches the Bible as a document emerging from within the context of their time. For many in traditional communities, his works were seen as heresy. Still, he lives as a traditional Jew. At the end of his book, How to Read the Bible, Coogle provides an interesting perspective on how he reconciles these worlds. He compares the search for the source of the Bible's divinity to the question of identifying the location of the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Jerusalem. After the destruction of the Holy of Holies, Jews were prohibited from walking on the ground on which it once stood. Though we may not know the precise location where it stood, explains Coogle, he would still avoid the entire mountain. In this sense, the Bible can be seen as the Temple Mount. Not everyone found this compelling. As David Plotz wrote in his New York Times review, Coogle also seeks a safe haven for rationalist believers. In other words, having broken all the windows, trashed the bedroom, stripped the wires for copper, sold the plumbing for scrap, and jackhammered into the foundation, Coogle proposes to move back into his Bible house. He and much of biblical criticism may have made our proverbial homes less welcoming, but they also pose an important challenge, one that, once confronted, can make the foundations of that home sturdier, more resilient, and perhaps a more captivating environment. In his humorous book, Living Biblically, author A.J. Jacobs chronicled trying to abide by the literal meaning of the Bible for an entire year. While mostly played for laughs, the work contained some surprising wisdom.
Third, that thou shalt have reverence. This one was not unexpected because I started the year as an agnostic, and by the end of the year I became what a friend of mine calls a reverent agnostic, which I love, and I'm trying to start it as a movement, so if anyone wants to join. The basic idea is whether or not there's a God, there's something important and beautiful about the idea of sacredness, and that our rituals can be sacred, the Sabbath can be sacred.
There is something about the search for the author within the Bible that can cultivate a sensitivity towards sacredness. Some lift this book and read with cynicism, but like Bartha's notion of the death of the author, our interactions with texts may say more about ourselves than the author. The story of our search for biblical authorship is just as much about the text's divinity as it is about man's humility and sense of the sacred. Some may never have the certitude of knowing who wrote the Bible. But even if you never find the author, you may just find yourself.